All right, let's dive into this one. Interpreter of Maladies by Jhumpa Lahiri. You sent this story in
Oh, yeah?
along with like some thoughts about the whole collection.
Yeah.
And going through it all, I mean, really what got me was how Lahiri uses this like seemingly simple vacation story, but there's all this, there's all this complexity like underneath it all.
It's true. There's a lot simmering beneath the surface. Like, even just the setting, right? A hot July day. We've got a journey to the Sun Temple in Konarak.
Right.
It's not just a backdrop. The way Lahiri describes it, the landscape, even the monkeys in the trees, like you can practically feel that tension building.
And speaking of tension,
Yeah.
Mr. and Mrs. Days.
Yeah.
Right. You pointed out their dynamic, and I mean, they're bickering constantly. And it's more than just your like typical vacation stress.
Right.
He's like buried in his tour book. She's snapping at the kids. I mean, they're physically together.
Yeah.
But you get the sense that they're
All
emotionally
still-
miles apart.
Yeah, and that disconnect, it's like it goes way beyond this one couple, right? It's like a recurring thing in all of Lahiri's work. This exploration of how communication breaks down
Right.
in relationships, you know, and like so often her characters are surrounded by family,
Yeah.
but they still feel so isolated.
Yeah, like they're speaking totally different languages.
Yes.
Even when they're using the same words.
Yeah.
Which, it's interesting because you pointed out how Mrs. Das is like fascinated with Mr. Capazzi's job as an interpreter. She even calls it romantic, which is kind of ironic given her own marriage.
It is. And, that irony, I don't think it's lost on Mr. Capazzi either, you know? Here he is, stuck in this routine that he doesn't find fulfilling. Dreaming of being a diplomat,
Right.
and all of a sudden, this beautiful woman's hanging on his every word. Finding meaning in a job that he kind of sees as, mundane.
Right, he feels seen, right?
Yes.
Like somebody finally gets him. And Lahiri even describes Mrs. Das's attention as like mildly intoxicating
Oh, yeah.
for Mr. Capazzi, which, says a lot
Totally.
about his loneliness.
Exactly. And this is where I think Lahiri takes us like deeper into these characters, right? Because is Mr. Capazzi really connecting with Mrs. Das?
Right.
Or is this all about, his needs, his desires that he's projecting onto her?
That is a great question.
Yeah.
And it gets even more relevant, I think, when you think about Mrs. Das's motivations.
Right.
You pointed out that moment where she revealed her secret
Yes.
about Bobby to Mr. Capazzi, and it really is, I think, a turning point in this story. Why do you think she confides in him?
I mean,
His virtual stranger.
I think it goes back to that idea of interpretation. It's like she's looking for more than just somebody to translate words. She wants somebody to decipher her emotions, to give her like a remedy for her guilt.
So she's kind of, in a way, romanticizing his job.
Yeah.
Just like she romanticized his role as this interpreter, but now it's like she's putting this huge burden on him
Yeah.
to absolve her of this secret that she's been carrying for years.
And think about the power dynamic here.
Right.
At first, Mrs. Das, she's the one in control.
Right.
She's giving Mr. Capazzi all this attention.
Yeah.
And now she's, vulnerable.
Yeah.
She's relying on him for support. It's a fascinating shift.
So how does Mr. Capazzi react to all this?
Oh, he's conflicted, for sure. I mean, like, on the one hand, he's flattered by her trust, even drawn to her vulnerability a bit.
Right.
But at the same time, I think he sees the weight of what she's asking.
Yeah.
He's an interpreter at a doctor's office, dealing with physical stuff, not really equipped for this kind of emotional turmoil.
In your notes, you said you thought Mr. Capazzi's response was like particularly insightful. He actually questions if what Mrs. Das is feeling is really pain or just guilt. Yeah. What do you make of that?
I think that's where Lahiri is just, brilliant.
Right.
Mr. Capazzi, even though he's getting kind of swept up in this whole encounter, he still manages to keep like a level of detachment.
Right.
He's observing Mrs. Das, not just hearing her words, but trying to understand those emotions behind them. And when he does that, I think he kind of challenges her perception of herself.
Which, as you can imagine, doesn't go over so well.
Right.
She's furious that he would even question her feelings.
Totally. Like, it's this total rejection of the role she's trying to put him in. She wants him to be the, magical problem solver, and he's kind of disrupting that whole fantasy.
And then that rejection becomes literal
Yeah.
when she storms off, drops that piece of paper with his address.
Oh, right.
which is like this symbol of their fleeting connection.
That lost address, that is such a powerful image.
Yeah.
Like, their encounter was so fragile, the way, expectations can just crumble like that.
And speaking of expectations crumbling, what about those monkeys?
Oh, yeah.
Working in the background this whole time, it's almost like foreshadowing
Totally.
all this chaos that's about to happen.
Exactly. And then it all comes out when Mrs. Dye spills that puffed rice,
Right.
tracks the monkeys, and it's like this primal force is unleashed.
Oh, yeah.
Reminding us that even amidst all this human drama, there are these forces we can't control.
And monkeys go after Bobby,
Right.
the kid at the center of Mrs. Dawes' confession.
Yeah.
Kind of ironic, right?
Yeah.
A minute ago, she's distancing herself from him, not his, and now she's frantic.
It really highlights how complex her feelings are.
Right.
Like, is it that, maternal instinct, or is she realizing how deep her deception really goes?
And where's Mr. Capassi during all this?
Well, he's basically forced into the role of hero,
Right.
saving Bobby from these monkeys, but that act, it doesn't bring him closer to Mrs. Dye.
Right.
If anything, it breaks the illusion he had about her.
Yeah, he sees her clearly now.
Yeah.
Not this sophisticated woman, but someone who's really flawed, selfish.
Yeah, this is it, the turning point. That connection they had,
Right.
based on misunderstanding, unmet desires, it all unraveled.
And then the story ends with the Daz family just leaving, completely oblivious to the lost address, to, everything that happened. It's like their whole encounter with Mr. Capassi was just another tourist thing.
Right. But for Mr. Capassi, it's not.
Right.
He's left with this image of their dysfunction and this glimpse into this family and a culture he'll never fully get.
It's interesting, though, how they just kind of move on.
Yeah.
The Daz family, like, untouched
Right.
by all that. But for Mr. Capassi, it's like this defining thing.
It is. He's left with, the weight of her confession, that connection they had, and, realizing that he just totally misread her. And, in your request, you mentioned how Interpreter of Maladies reflects, the bigger themes of the whole collection.
Right. And this story really is about that misinterpretation.
Yeah.
Characters not really seeing each other.
And it's not just about them misinterpreting each other, right?
Right.
There's that whole cultural misinterpretation thing going on, too.
Yeah.
I mean, the Dawes family, they're Indian, but they're so out of sync with the whole culture.
Exactly. Like they're looking at India as a spectacle.
Right.
Not something to experience, but just to observe.
With their cameras and guidebooks.
Totally.
Yeah.
And that disconnect, it speaks to this bigger thing in Lahiri's work, right? The immigrant experience.
Right.
Being caught between two worlds.
Yeah, never belonging to either one.
Exactly.
And Mr. Capassi, he's dealing with that too.
Yes.
That feeling of displacement, stuck in this life that doesn't feel fulfilling.
Like he's yearning for something more. Just like the Daz family, they're looking for connection, but they can't find it, not even in their own family.
In your notes, you talked about the monkeys, that symbolism. I think it's worth looking at again. Totally. They're this chaotic element.
Right.
Disrupting that perfect vacation picture.
Right.
And in a way, they kind of mirror that chaos inside each of them.
That's so true. They're like this physical representation of all that tension.
Exactly. And those unspoken desires just simmering there under the surface.
Yeah, they're a force of nature, like those emotions driving everyone, unpredictable, right?
Right. And when Mr. Capassi saves Bobby,
Yeah.
it's not just heroic. He's stepping into that chaotic space and disrupting those roles everyone's playing.
So as we're, wrapping up this deep dive, what resonates most with you about Interpreter of Maladies?
For me, it's that reminder, underneath even the most ordinary encounter, there's this depth of emotion and complexity. Lahiri makes us look beyond what we see on the surface, to think about the things that people want, their disappointments, all those things that shape how we interact.
And she does it so beautifully. With this understated style, the way she writes, it's simple, but it draws you in.
Oh.
You see those cracks, those contradictions.
It's a story that stays with you.
Absolutely.
Makes you think about your own experiences.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up, we want to leave you with something to think about.
Yeah.
Mr. Capassi, he's an interpreter of languages and emotions.
Right.
Think about this. How often do we really see the people around us? Beyond the roles they play and the stories they tell.
Yeah.
And how often are we the ones being misunderstood?
Mm-hmm.
Our own intentions, lost in translation. Keep thinking about that. Until next time, keep diving.